have access or to go online. So let's give it 5 minutes more and then we start. Okay. Thank you. Okay, I think it's safe to start now. The others might be coming on board soon. Okay, so a pleasant day to everyone, and welcome to the 27th episode of Tuesdays with MEFIN. And our topic for today is again something of interest to everybody. and it's on cross-border criteria for climate and disaster risk insurance for Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. This is actually a study commissioned by our project, RFPI Asia 3, well, with the aim, of course, of coming up with common criteria for the development and promotion of CDRI in the three countries where RFPI operates, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, otherwise known as the VIP for an acronym. We will be having a very interesting presentation today, and I don't want to keep you waiting. By the way, I'm Ronnie Limbago. I'm your moderator for today. So, Shine, could we move to the next slide, please? Okay. So we go on to the welcome remarks, which were supposed to be given by our program director, Dr. Steigerwald, that unfortunately he's not available for today. Instead, I'll be calling on our officer in charge, our colleague Dante Portula, to deliver the remarks on behalf of Dr. Steigerwald. Dante, please.
Thank you, Ronnie. Yes, unfortunately, Dr. Volker will not be able to join us, but I am glad to deliver the welcome message on his behalf. But first, I'd like to greet everyone pleasant good morning or good day, depending on location, to this Tuesdays with MEFIN webinar, which is the 27th episode. So I wish that everyone's family continue to be safe and healthy, both in the midst of the pandemic and this also challenging weather that we have since last week. So we are all witnessing in our country and or in other economies the seemingly changing pattern of climate. So it is like climate is creating its new climate pattern. The intensity and severity of natural catastrophes such as typhoons and floods are increasing. Cross-border criteria for climate and disaster risk insurance, or we call it CDRI, which is the topic for today's webinar, is very relevant in developing CDRI solutions, especially for the low-income and the vulnerable communities who are the most impacted by natural catastrophes in the midst of this health pandemic. Learning from each other's experience and good practices across border of jurisdiction is important, so we do not need to reinvent the wheel in addressing the impacts of natural catastrophes through insurance. Today's webinar will present and discuss the results of the brand new study on cross-border criteria for CDRI, focusing on three large economies of Southeast Asia, and that these are the Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. This study was commissioned by the GIZ RFPI Asia 3 program. I would like to thank the consultant who did the study, Mr. Milindra Singh, who is with us today, for also presenting the result of the study in this webinar. I would like to encourage the attendees to actively participate, not only by posting their questions in the chat box, but also by sharing your experience and thoughts, because it will enhance the findings of the study if we are able to capture more case examples. And finally, GIZ, RFPI Asia, and the MEFIN network will continue to provide you with relevant topics through the series of Tuesdays with MEFIN webinar. We look forward to your feedback from this episode. And once again, good day to all. Back to you, Ronnie.
Thank you very much, Dante, for delivering the remarks and for putting in context our webinar for today. That was very aptly said. Can we move to the next slide, Shine? So we go now into the webinar guidance, and these are basically just guidelines for the smooth implementation of our webinar. So first of all, please turn off your microphone and webcams to conserve the internet bandwidth. And for the, well, as I mentioned, the smooth and uninterrupted flow of the webinar. As you know, sometimes if all cams are open, it consumes the bandwidth, and we have some technical glitches. For questions, which I'm sure you all have, please post them in the chat box that is provided in the MS Teams. Our team will be then picking them up, and we will be raising all of this during the Q&A session. Okay. The slides for this presentation will be shared after the event via email and in the MEFIN Facebook group. Next slide, please. So this is our agenda for today. I apologize if it's quite small, but we just finished the webinar guidance. And we now go directly into the meat of the discussion for today, which is on CDR, cross-border criteria for CDRI in the three countries, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And for that, we have, as the presenter, the person who actually did the study for RFPI Asia, Mr. Milindra Singh, who is an independent consultant. We have been working with Milindra for quite some time now, I think 3 to 4 years already, and he has been delivering us very excellent studies and researches. And if you're wondering why today we have the Tuesdays with MEFIN at 10 o'clock, it's because Milindra is based in Seattle, USA. So we are accommodating, of course, the time difference between the two countries. And I think Dante already mentioned this a while ago, and Milindra also mentioned this in one of our meetings. CDRI becomes more emphasized now. Well, for example, in Seattle, he mentioned that the climate is trying to create its own ecosystem. So the world is changing right now, which gives more impetus to the importance of CDRI. And so without further ado, I would like to call on Milindra to give his presentation. The presentation will last for 20 minutes. So Milindra, please.
Hello. Hi, sir. Thank you for the really humbling introduction. I appreciate that. And I'm really glad to be part of this. Before I jump to it, I just want to make sure that my video and audio is working well. So if somebody from the GIZ team can just give me a quick confirmation that my video and audio is working well.
Well, yes, Milindra.
Okay.
They're both working fine.
Great, thank you. So let me just quickly jump into a quick introduction about myself. So I think it was previously mentioned that I've been working with GIZ since about 3 years. This has included a lot of projects in the micro insurance space, looking at value chain, doing value chain analysis, but also looking at data privacy, specifically in the insurance sector. And now, with the times that we're living in, it's imperative to think about climate change and how insurance plays a big role in enabling it. And I was having a meeting with the GIZ team, and I think Sir Dante touched upon the piece about Seattle. So maybe some people are aware about the heat wave that was going on in the US a couple of weeks ago. So I think the temperatures in Seattle hit 50 degrees Celsius, nearly in some parts. In where I was living, the temperature was about 43 degrees Celsius, which has never happened before. Like this temperature has never been something that people living in the state of Washington have ever experienced. At the same time, in January, since I was here in January as well, it's the first time it snowed in Seattle. So I've kind of, this kind of puts into perspective that there's no real time to change or pivot or think about climate change in the future, because it's something that's happening now. And if you're aware about what's happening in Germany, Belgium, in Henan in China, what's happening in Turkey, and also what's happening in the US, with both flooding as well as fires, there's really no time. And the insurance sector is one of the biggest sectors that's going to play a big part in protecting both resources as well as people. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a context before we actually jump into the meat of the presentation, just to give people a little bit more personal thought about how I'm thinking about this and how this kind of culminated into this report. So could we move to the next slide, please? We can skip this one. The next one would work. Right. Thank you. So the objective for today's presentation as well as the report, there are basically three core components. The first part is identifying and highlighting the common challenges faced in all three countries. So we didn't look at any country specifically and highlight the issues in a silo. We spoke to stakeholders across the region, came up with the commonalities, the common challenges to come up with the criteria. The second is, based on the interviews with our insurance stakeholders, with our regulators, we want to surface the criteria to the audience today, and dig a little bit deep about how you actually can go about implementing and executing this. Next slide, please. So to set a little bit of high context, we're going to take a future lens, and this data was taken from a very strong, very nice McKinsey report, which talked about what the climate change by 2050 looks like. And 2050 is not that far away if you actually think about it. So in terms of just the region, you have about 1 billion people in Asia that would be affected by lethal heat waves. We are already seeing this happen in some parts of the world. In terms of the financial impact, there'll be a decline of 2.8 trillion to 4.7 trillion of the Asian gross domestic product due to extreme heat and humidity. So let's think about this number as it plays into the insurance sector. So with declining economies, there'll be less and less for people to actually pay as premium. So how are we thinking about mitigating this before it actually happens? When we talk about ensuring capital structures in Asia, there's 1.2 trillion are at risk of inland flooding, accounting to about 70% of global assets. If you look at what's happening in Germany and Henan, these are basically like physical infrastructure that have come into that have been basically destroyed by the flooding. So how are we thinking about protecting these in a more sustainable way? Next slide, please. So when we think about risks, we think about it in three ways. There's transitional risks, there's physical risks, and there's liability risk. Transitional risk basically refers to what the risks are to move to a low carbon economy. There will be disruptions. There will be people who might be disrupted in terms of occupation, even movement, migration might be impacted. Physical risk basically refers to what I touched upon earlier with infrastructure, and liability risk. It kind of speaks for itself, so I won't spend too much time on this. I'm sure the insurance world understands liability better than me. Next slide. So if we look at one part of this, we don't need to spend too much time on this slide. It can be referred to in the report. But if we just look at one of the columns that's on the left side, which talks about the risk increase across socio-economic factors, specifically on the working and living in conditions. And you can see that across all three countries, that's Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, there's going to be the risk is very high in terms of working and living in conditions. And this is going to directly impact the economy. The same issues are highlighted in terms of physical assets and infrastructure, natural capital, and food systems. So you can see how changes year over year in climate change is going to impact all four columns across all three countries nearly equally. So this is not a Philippines issue. This is not a Vietnam issue. This is actually a collective regional issue. So when we're thinking about moving the needle in this region, we have to be thinking about our partners in the different countries. Next slide. So just for the interest and just to make sure that we are all aligned on the definition of CDRI, we just put this slide in to basically define it that CDRI is considered as a kind of insurance a traditional or a micro insurance product. But it can be interchangeably used with words like climate risk insurance, disaster risk insurance. So it's kind of a broad umbrella term, but we don't want to, we want to make sure that when we start thinking about these products, to kind of use the terminology of CDRI, just to make sure that we are all aligned and speaking to the same thing. So this is one recommendation that I would suggest as we're thinking about this within our own organizations. Next slide, please. So after speaking to our partners, our stakeholders in the 3 regions, there were 4 common challenges that surfaced when it came to CDRI. These challenges are common across microinsurance as well. But what was interesting that the same challenges exist within the CDRI space. So the first is the high operational costs. We had most of our private sector companies highlight the operational cost of B2C and B2B models. We had spoken to startups as well who are using more innovative business models to actually scale up through interesting B2B models, which I've highlighted in the report. There's a startup called Pula that's actually seen a lot of success in Africa. So I would encourage people to think about how are you going to reduce high operational costs either internally or through partnerships with other players, more nimble and more flexible players in the market. The second is the high financial risk for insurers. This goes without saying that catastrophe risks pose a very high risk to insurers, reinsurers. This has basically limited the amount of products that are actually developed and are actually a barrier to scale across the region. The third is the lack of customers' trust. CDRI is not something that's easy to explain to folks, in the sector who actually been working in the region. So actually explaining CDRI to the poor and raising the awareness among the most vulnerable is even a bigger challenge. And then you throw in the cultural and the cultural barriers around Vietnam, Indonesia, and Philippines, which each is so unique. You create something. It turns out to be even more challenging for development agencies, governments to actually scale up. So there's opportunity here to think about how we can build that customer trust across the region. And the fourth is lack of willingness to pay. So if you think about the poor and the vulnerable, many of them have been living with with climate change, impacting them in some way or form in terms of droughts, climate change, in terms of flooding. So it's really hard to actually convince people to pay in advance of something that either they're used to it or something that they don't anticipate or actually fully understand. So next slide, please. So having built up the context and understood some of the challenges, I'll quickly briefly go through some of the findings in all 3 countries. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I want to spend more time on the recommendations. So we can just move to the next slide for Vietnam. So the 3 top challenges that emerged across Vietnam was number 1, low adoption. We spoke to partners in Vietnam and realized that there were pilots that were run in the country. But there were very few success stories, very few case studies that actually emerged in terms of a scalable product in the region. But we do know that Vietnam is making the efforts. There are government efforts to actually scale this up. The other one was dependence on subsidy for agri-insurance. There's a high dependence on subsidies. Subsidies are also at the same time needed. So this has become one of the challenges actually scaling up the product in the region. And the third is a lack of product diversity. There was a first pilot that was created, but the number of products, the number of solutions has actually limited the growth of CDRI in the region. At the same time, we have government policies, specifically Decree 58, that is actually aimed at enhancing the capability of the public sector, the agricultural sector to kind of raise awareness. build more scalable and long-lasting strategies. And after speaking with one or two stakeholders in the region, we can see that there is a move, but it requires the partnership from other countries because it's not something that can be done in isolation. So if you have partners, if you're working with, I think there's an opportunity here for GIZ to kind of lead the collaboration. I would encourage our partners in the Philippines to actually work with partners in Vietnam as well, because there's a lot of knowledge sharing that can happen between the two countries. Next slide, please. So in terms of recommendations for Vietnam, we basically feel that, number one, there needs to be an establishment of an expanded policy in inclusive insurance, which is something that's been missing. There has to be a concerted effort to build financial literacy, specifically on CDRI amongst the poorest and the most vulnerable. And more importantly, there needs to be specific KPIs, monitoring and evaluation, risk management in local communities. So we specified some KPIs in the report that I would encourage people to read about how they can actually build data-driven insights to actually measure the success of new innovations and new products. Next slide. We can now move to Indonesia, just to quickly touch upon some of the salient recommendations. Next slide. So if you think about the Indonesian climate change factors, you can see that between 1989 and 2019, there were 289 disasters. The government is spending nearly 1.6 billion between 2000 and 2016 just for natural disasters. And there's an average spend of 300 to 500 million annually on reconstruction. So the question that came to my mind when I read this was, can this money actually be used differently to actually build resilience and build something in a proactive way versus waiting to be reactive? Next slide. And speaking of the reactive piece, the top challenge in Indonesia was reactive preparedness. The government has built emergency funds. There's a robust system to actually take care of property through insurance, to take care of physical assets after a disaster happened, which is extremely important. But as we're seeing climate change expedite and become faster than what we were previously anticipating, there needs to be reactive preparedness versus just being proactive. There should be proactive preparedness versus just being reactive about it. And similar to Vietnam, poor adoption was one of the lagging factors keeping this product from actually scaling. So I won't talk too much on the adoption piece, and I'll move more to some of the recommendations for Indonesia. So number one recommendation for Indonesia was to limit the credit life products there were limited products in the region. Most of them were aimed towards credit life products, specifically in the agricultural sector. So when we're thinking about CDRI, there's an opportunity to think about which other sectors of the market can this product actually serve. So zooming out from the agricultural sector and applying it and seeing how we can actually diversify across different sectors. The other one, which is I feel that's been successfully implemented in the Philippines, is actually using cooperatives and using that as a mechanism to scale. So I know in the Philippines we have organizations like One CISP organizations like One CISP also making it mandatory for some of its members. So there's an opportunity for these organizations to actually scale through cooperatives. In addition to that, there's also an opportunity for formalizing the insurance solution. So I know in Indonesia there are informal institutions offering insurance solutions, but they don't come under the umbrella of regulators. So that that poses sort of a limitation to how much they can scale and how much support that they can get from the government. So there's definitely an opportunity there for Indonesia to scale. Next slide. And then moving to the Philippines. Next slide. So as we know, the Philippines is not immune to the disasters in the region. So we have typhoons, floods, landslides impacting almost 60% of the total land area. We had a study from International Rice Research Institute, which shows that the grain yield decreased by at least 10% for each 1 degree increase in growing seasonal minimum temperature in the dry season. And ADB did a study which said that the country stands to lose 6% of its GDP annually by 2100 if we disregard climate change risks. Next slide. For the Philippines, we saw like around 5 top challenges that emerged. The first was a lack of index-based insurance. So there's definitely a big opportunity here to actually build a robust index-based product. So huge opportunity for the private sector to innovate. Again, there was a lack of product diversity, not that many CDRI products serving MSMEs, which are hit the most during a disaster. Lack of subsidy for CDRI for the poor. Public finances was something that was a missing element. The private sector, rightfully so, is apprehensive about entering this full on because of the high risks that we see with catastrophes. And there is a limited lack of participation in online solutions. So as we've seen how we can scale any insurance product to technology, there is an opportunity here to think about how these products and services can be scaled through partnerships with other technology companies, but also how you can scale it up internally. Next slide. So the first, about the 5 recommendations for the Philippines is, number 1, working with a multidisciplinary task force like the ones that GIZ, World Bank, and ADB actually have, creating these in a way that it takes into consideration all stakeholders to kind of drive this forward, providing the support that's needed on all sides. We encourage the private insurers to actually start piloting and testing new products. There are some specific recommendations on using the sandboxing approach to actually test this out. Financial and digital literacy is something that was missing. We didn't see a lot of people informed about this, having the means to be informed about it through technology platforms, and also taking a proportional approach, allowing innovative distribution and using technology to scale. So just to kind of like summarize the findings for the 3 countries before we move on to spending maybe a couple of more minutes on the recommendations, which is the next slide, which will cover broadly what the recommendations are and what the criteria are. Next slide. Next. So we've summarized the cross-border criteria into 8 components. The first is human-centeredness, and we'll go through each one in a couple of minutes. These recommendations are talked about in detail in the report. So I would encourage everybody to read through it, since these are very comprehensive recommendations. So we can move to the first one, which is human-centeredness. Next slide. So when we think about human-centeredness, it basically means thinking about a problem and applying this approach to when you're thinking about creating new products. So broadly, this is divided into 3 components. The first is inspiration, the second is ideation, and the third is implementation. So the questions that you can ask are as follows. Next slide. So when you're thinking about inspiration, I think the first question is like, in everybody's mind is, how do I actually get this started? How do I conduct interviews, focus group discussions and emotions? How do I focus the needs of the people? So this is an important component, something that we didn't find comprehensively being actually used. It does get implemented in some way or form, but there's no structured way it's actually been implemented, and that's something that was missing from the conversation that we had with our stakeholders. The second is ideation, asking what tools you need, how do I prototype this, how do I turn these insights into effective CDRI products? So these are questions that are extremely important as you're thinking about these a CDRI execution. And the third is implementation. It's not enough that you're thinking just about the idea at the execution, but also how you're thinking about assessing the impact. So we're going end to end here, thinking about the idea, how do we actually implement it, but also how we actually measure success. Next slide. The second is affordability. It's really important when you're thinking about CDRI to make sure that the user's cash flows in pricing insurance premiums is taken into account. The second is subsidies for CDRI leverage, making sure that we take advantage of the subsidies that are offered by the countries, or if there are pools in the region that can be actually be leveraged for country-specific initiatives. The third is insurance products should be bundled. CDRI as it stands, as a product by itself might not be as effective. So there are ways to think about how this can be actually bundled with existing more profitable products to kind of scale and make sure that the adoption is higher. And the possibility of mandatory insurance. Like I mentioned earlier, that you have organizations like One CISP mandating and making it mandatory for the members to avail a product. So this could be, this can be debated, but there is some value in thinking about how this can be actually implemented across the region. Next slide. The third is accessibility, using cost-effective distribution channels. One is the partner agent model. MFIs, retailers, utility and telecom companies have used a similar model, but there is value in not reinventing the wheel and actually leveraging these existing models to scale. Mutually beneficial cooperatives and other community-based models is something that can be actually scaled. I know some of it, especially in the Philippines, seems very obvious, but there is value in seeing like how this can be actually taken as a case study and applied in different situations as well. And the 3.2 is the availability and use of online solutions. So we're seeing migration of people to being people in that there is definitely an affinity for people to use technology tools and digital platforms even when they're purchasing policies online. So how do we actually leverage that? And that is one recommendation that we've mentioned in terms of scaling up accessibility. Next slide. Awareness and literacy. When we looked at some of the data in terms of like where, how much and how people are informed, we did see a gap in what was being stated versus the awareness on the ground. So when you're thinking about a CDRI financial literacy program, it's very important that inclusive insurance that covers property and social protection is taken into consideration when you're thinking about this. Make sure that you're bridging the financial knowledge and the climate risk gap. So we're not just talking about the financial piece, but also educating about the risk associated with climate change. And making sure that when we're thinking about these campaigns, we're taking three components, which is, our stakeholders, the key messages in a clear manner, and developing new communication strategies. So in the report, we've highlighted this in detail, and I encourage the audience to have a read because we've gone into a very in-depth about how this can be used as a successful lever when you're thinking about CDRI. Next slide. Organizational support and structure. It's going to be very challenging if we're not going to have the support coming from the top down. So when it comes to senior leadership, whether it's in the government or it's in a company, it's imperative that there is direction and there's buy-in from senior leaders to actually adopt this. So the first is establishing a vision, creating a strategy, something that is a strategy that balances both the financial and the social piece of it. But also actually being able to execute it and creating business processes specifically for CDRI. So whether that's hiring the right people for the job or building business units dedicated to support that strategy. So it's not something that should be done in isolate. It should not be something that's done as an ad hoc, but it should be something that's actually embedded within the organization. One way to do that is creating champions in the organizations, both from the top and middle management who are actually passionate about this and actually can scale this and make it financially viable. Next slide. And then moving to the reinsurance and risk pooling, this goes without a doubt that reinsurance is something that's extremely important. Right now, as it stands in the region, reinsurance support is limited. There is a lot of opportunity here to actually work with international players, work with funds, work with development agents to actually create risk mitigating reinsurance products and support, especially for Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. As I mentioned in the risk pooling mechanisms, we have highlighted some of the risk pools that exist and have been a success in the report. Specifically in the Philippines, you have the PCDIP, the PCIF, which actually provide a strong mechanism for at least the Philippines to actually build, to actually think about how price and risk in associated disaster-prone areas can actually be scaled. So this is specifically targeted towards the insurance sector. So I think this is a really good case study for, especially for the PCIF, how that can be built out across the region. Next slide. The other one was making sure that, number one, we have our KPIs in place. We know what we need to measure for success. And also the question is, are we still going to continue using the traditional KPIs for the regular insurance products, or are we going to think about creating new ways of measuring success for CDRI? And in the report, we've highlighted a big section providing specific KPIs that the companies can think about as you're thinking about measuring success. The other piece was alignment with national global goals. Every country is united with the SDGs in mind. We see governments aligning to the UN sustainability goals since 2015, since they were launched. And these have kind of fit into the national policies of each country. Specifically, when you're thinking about CDRI, you can think about SDG number 1, which is no poverty. You have SDG number 8, which talks about infrastructure. You have SDG 9, 10, which is speaking of reducing inequalities. 11 is talking about sustainable communities. And within each SDG, there are callouts and there are specific targets when it comes to climate change. So I would encourage, a quick understanding and a quick read of the specific targets within each SDGs and see how that aligns with the broader CDRI goal of a company or of the government. Next slide. And finally, I've spoken a bit about this, is technology and innovation. We've in my previous report, I've talked a lot about data analytics and using AI, and these things are awesome to kind of scale, raise awareness, and build capacity. So when we think about technology, it's not just restricted to using an app, but there are many components from like the back end to building capacity to working with startups to actually scale and build infrastructure both in the back end as well as in the front end to scale this up. The other one is participation in regulatory sandboxes. Each country, I know Indonesia and the Philippines have policies in place for regulatory sandboxes. One example that comes to mind is that of ADB. ADB has been running very successful sandbox approaches through the technology team since about 2017, if I'm not mistaken. So this provides a low risk environment for companies to innovate, experiment, and start scaling and see what works and what doesn't work. It's also a really good opportunity to kind of get partnerships with startups, and also a great tool to kind of tell people and tell the development agencies and secure that kind of support that's needed for these types of products. Next slide. So in conclusion, I want to leave people with a few questions when you're thinking about CDRI. The first, and all these questions are kind of tied to the 8 criteria that I just suggest that we're recommending people think about. And using these questions, I think it's a good starting point to kind of scale, and also build that working partnership across Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. So with that, I will conclude the presentation. I'm happy to take follow-ups and answer any questions that the audience might have. And as Sir Dante pointed out, that we want to encourage people to also answer each other's questions and keep it more interactive. So I'll stop there, and I just want to say thank you for having me, and happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Milindra, for that very interesting presentation. So we now move on to the question and answer portion, or the open forum. And as already mentioned earlier, we not only encourage questions, but also the sharing of experiences from others. Okay. And as while Milindra was doing the presentation, I could already see some interesting exchanges, which I think could be given more light by our participants, and then probably this would lead into a, let's say, a more meaningful or deeper discussion, given that there are certain comparisons between the Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia. Excuse me. So with that, there are actually a lot of sharing here, but there's something that actually struck me the most. And I hope that Mr. Agus Nugroho would be willing to share his inputs as well as the others, given his comment from Indonesia. Okay, so he shared that in Indonesia, in the community, there's a local word called arisan or jula-jula, which sometimes is, well, it misreplaced with insurance. So it's actually, how do you put this? Well, misinterpreted as insurance, maybe. So locally, traditional farmers presume or demand a cash return after they have made some payment in advance. In insurance, you just cannot provide claims all the time, and this is the root cause of low insurance penetration in Indonesia and low rejoining in insurance. Okay, so this is I think, a very interesting comment, and I think it's also related to another comment from from the same person, Mr. Agus, that it might be difficult. I mean, comparing the Philippines and Indonesia. For example, the Philippines using cooperatives is quite a successful way to promote insurance and CDRI. But in Indonesia, that might not be the case. So may we hear from Mr. Agus, first of all, to give us some clarity on this Arisan and Jula-Jula. Mr. Agus, please.
Thank you, Dante, and thank you for the speakers, and thank you for this kind of opportunity. Can you hear my voice clearly here?
Yes, you're loud and clear, Mr. Agus.
Okay, thank you very much,
Yes,
Dante.
Agus.
We met last time in Bangkok in ADPC ADPC event.
Yes. That's right.
Okay. In the case of Indonesia and I mean, in my opinion, some researchers they assume that local people are already aware about the terms of insurance, and we have to know that Indonesia consists of a lot of culture and different language and etc. For example, in some islands in Indonesia, there are no local words called arisan, but in Sumatran island they don't have any word of arisan, but they know another term. But the main focus of those two words is that if local farmers they pay or they have made a payment in advance, and then normally they require they demand in return for their cash that they have been saving in the kind of programs. So when the farmers could not get what they expect in the case of cash or return in any type of payments, it will decrease their willingness to join the insurance in the next periods. So I have conducted some research in this case, and for example, the figure is very fantastic. In this, for example, in one period, there are 2,000 farmers involved in the agricultural insurance. The next years in the same area is just zero. No farmers will join in the same programs. That happens not only in one area but also in many areas in Indonesia. So, and I read the comment that the problem may be the literacy rate is very low. I guess that's not that will be a simple answer for me. It's not only the it's not only the literation, because insurance itself is a strange word. I mean, new words, new adopted words in Indonesian. We don't have any kind of kind of terminology, especially in Muslim. I do apologize that Indonesia consists of Muslim populations. In Indonesia, we only believe in God, so we put risk in God's hand, not in any financial mechanism. So in that case, that's why the term of insurance itself, we have to insure our activity ourselves to in God's hands. In many population in Indonesia believe in that case. So when the financial modern engineering financial project in terms of insurance, they're reluctant to join because of that kind of two reasons. One is the they demand the insurance cannot provide the claims in every period, or they demand they cannot get the cash. And then second one is the term itself. So I think that was my opinion, Dante and the speakers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pak Agus, for that very interesting sharing of experience. Okay, given the very, very big diversity in Indonesia, I think you're 17,000 plus islands, and culture and religion, actually, from what you said, that has a big influence, even in insurance. So financial literacy actually will really be a key factor for the promotion of not only CDRI but insurance himself. I think that's the message that we're getting from you. Okay, so thank you very much for that. And I think actually we have the same thing here. It's not really the same, but I mean more or less similar since I noticed that there's a cash return made after some payment. In the Philippines,
sorry,
I think this is termed
excuse me, Dante, can I add one second? Just another thought that I would like to share.
Yes.
In Indonesia, there is a single project in agriculture that we call it AUTP, Asuransi Usaha Tani Padi, or rice insurance, for example, Indonesia. And in my opinion, in the case of agricultural insurance, the best way to fit the insurance program is to fit the insurance into the kind of a commodity that very high, that has a quite competitive price. For example, coffee or cocoa or something like that. Not in paddy. Why paddy? Because paddy is a kind of daily. They plant paddy for basic needs, not for trades. But in the case of coffee or cocoa or some other commodity, they plant this commodity for export market. So the price premium or the price that they obtain from the export or trading into the international market will cover the insurance premium, for example. So that can be this consideration may shift the concern from the insurance policy in Indonesian stakeholder. If you want to apply the agricultural insurance, better for you to, or better for us in Indonesia to apply it in certain commodities, not in paddy. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much again for that interesting input. Maybe we could hear a reaction first from our presenter, Milindra. Can I have a reaction from you regarding this particular input of having a different commodity other than rice, where agri-insurance might be more successful?
Could you repeat that, Sir Dante? Voice is breaking up a little bit. Sorry.
This is Ronnie.
Ronnie.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, Mr. Pak Agus actually shared that for maybe that for agri insurance to be more successful, it should be focused on other crops or commodities like coffee instead of rice. Given that coffee is a more premium product and it is for export, that's basically the gist of what he said, and that might contribute to the increased uptake of insurance. Just your thoughts on this.
Yeah, absolutely. So number one, I think that's a very good recommendation, and that kind of fits in with something that we shared earlier, which is thinking about which other parts of agriculture can CDRI actually be implemented in. So yes, we have agriculture, but agriculture is a vast sector. So I think a recommendation of other products is definitely other commodities is definitely a good step forward. So I think that can something we can, that's something that there's something there, and I think we can build on that idea and learn more from like how that can be actually scaled up in Indonesia. The second thing that I would say is that I mentioned this during the presentation, but there's this company called Pula in Africa where they actually are looking at other products than the staples. Like in some countries is rice, in some countries is corn. So they are actually developing models to actually assess, what the risks would look like when you're thinking about these other products, and what the premiums would look like when you're thinking about other kinds of commodities. That's what I would say to that. I could share more, but I'll stop there because I see some folks with have the hands raised. So
yes,
maybe
so
we can maybe.
Let's take a look at who are raising their hands. I think one of them is Dan. Okay, it's Dante and Shane. So let's put it. Dan, okay lang. Sorry. Dan, is it okay if we make it ladies first? Shane first, then you?
Of course, we could not resist that. Shane, go ahead.
Okay, ladies first. Hi, Shane. Hope you're doing fine.
Yeah, all is
Yes,
well.
please.
Yeah, Sir Ronnie, I just wanted to add that Pula is actually expanding in the Philippines, and that they are designing say agricultural products index based for crops such as cocoa and coffee. So I think it would be good as a point of like knowledge sharing to also get their experience in Africa because they were able to insure around maybe more than 3 million African farmers. That's my quick comments.
Okay, thank you very much, Shane, for sharing that information. I'm pretty sure everybody's now interested on how Pula did that. Okay, Dante, please go ahead with your question or comment.
Yeah, it's just actually kind of rejoinder to what Melindra already said, and also stemming from the comment of Agus. Uh, because I think also to make CDRI kind of feasible in the perspective of the insurance providers, insurance companies, they have to have a good mix of portfolio. Of course, in this CDRI, government really plays a major role. This is a space where government comes in stronger if we compared it to microinsurance, for example. Like in Indonesia, GIZ is working with the aquaculture sector. And here we have been discussing with the insurance industry. There are two consortium there. One that deals with the small farmers, and this is where government is providing their the direction because there is subsidy element. However, we could expect already that the industry is always raising this, the challenging issue of low premium rate, high claims ratio. But our our solution that we are discussing here is also to go into the traditional, the corporate markets. As Mr. Agus said, let's look at high valued commodities, so like shrimp, which is an export market. So we are trying to combine this portfolio to make it a bit more feasible to the insurance industry. They support the government agenda of helping the marginalized sector. This is the small farmers, but also doing business in parallel with the corporates, with the bigger, they call it the semi-intensive farms and intensive farms, so that they will be able to balance out the portfolio in terms of especially claims management, claims ratio.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan, for that. Yeah, for sharing those information. Yes, we do have that project at RFPI Asia. Now, as much as we'd like to entertain further comments and questions, I think we have to close the question and answer portion. But we'll try to forward your questions to Milindra also. And if Milindra has the time, maybe he could share his answers or share further information. So yeah, thank you very much, Milindra, and thank you everybody for that very interesting and active sharing of experiences and the thoughts. Now, Shine, could we move to the next slide, please? So for every webinar, we would like to find out how well we did, and so we go into this polling survey using Menti. So as you could see on the screen, you could either use your QR code or just follow the link that will lead you to the Menti survey. I think Shine, you'll also share the link via chat.
Yes, sir, I will.
Okay. So yeah, so let's give it a few minutes for everybody to get into
Here's the
the
link.
survey. Okay, so may we request the participants to please go to the link and let's do the survey. Okay. Shine, I cannot see my screen. The screen. Yeah. Okay, so there. Okay. So the first question is how useful were the information and knowledge you gained from the webinar for today on the cross-border criteria for CDRI? So yeah, please start. I mean, you're answering already anyway. We so far have 9, 10. So, okay, from 10 respondents, we already have. So, well, majority found it very useful, although there's one here which says it's not so useful. So maybe we have to take a look into that. Okay, so somebody still answering. Okay, thank you. Overall, it's very useful. Maybe now we could move to the next question. Were you able to get a good understanding of the success factors and challenges in the VIP countries, meaning Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, which affects their efforts in promoting CDRI? Okay, some more are still answering, but thank you again. The top answer is yes. We have an answer of not quite. We also have to take a look into that, although probably time is also a factor because this study is actually very extensive and we were trying to compress everything in a 20-minute presentation. Okay, so I think we could move on to the next one. Of the 8 criteria shown for today, which do you think are firmly established in your country and supports the growth of CDRI? I mean, you could just type your answers. Multiple answers are allowed. Oh, we're not seeing any answers. Okay, there's one, partnerships and business models. There were 8 criteria presented to you a while ago. So yeah, awareness and literacy, thank you. Risk pooling is there. Again, risk pooling and reinsurance. HCD is this human capacity development, I assume. Technology, literacy and awareness again. Oh, okay, Mr. Agos, Pak Agos, terima kasih for coming. He's leaving for another meeting. He shared that very interesting experience with us. Okay, you could continue answering, and then we, okay, accessibility because it's strong MBA and co-ops, okay. So let's move on to the last question. It's actually a reverse of this question. Shine, the next question na lang. So again, on the 8 cross-border criteria, this time around, which do you think needs further consideration and support in order to promote CDRI? So it means something which is not yet really established in your respective areas, and would it really support? Okay, we have our first answer, which is to push CDRI to be distributed via online marketplaces. Very true. Risk pooling, yes. The need for distribution channels is there. Cross-border regulation supported by regulatory arbitrage. Okay, that's true. Active commercial insurance participation. The KPIs, okay, it was raised here. Support monitoring and evaluation. Okay, let's just wait for some more. Okay, regulation is again mentioned. Linked to micro policies outside of insurance. Interesting. Aha, creating common regulations via ASEAN. So the cross-border criteria actually will play a role here. Okay, so well, you could continue answering, but I think we already have a good idea of what's on your mind regarding this question. So thank you very much for taking part in the survey. It's very helpful. Okay, so Shine, let's exit. Okay, with that survey, we conclude today's 27th episode of the Tuesdays with MEFIN. And first of all, we'd like to thank Milindra for taking time to present the cross-border criteria for us today. Much appreciated, Milindra. And of course, we'd like to thank all of you for taking part in today's webinar, even though with the time change, which is in the morning. And we hope to see you in the next episodes this August and July. Actually, an advance notice. We're having a series for July and August, and this will feature focus actually on technology-driven insurance products, focusing on the behavior and the motivations of customers, which affect the development of these products. So we're working on it, and we hope to see you in the next runs of Tuesdays with MEFIN. So have a safe, well, stay safe, enjoy the remainder of your day, and thank you again for coming.